Okay, welcome to chapter 10. We're going to be looking at this third part of unit 4. Let me remind you that the 3 chapters in unit 4, chapters 8, 9, and 10, all are dealing with a different theme within the same time period, 1800 to 1848. Chapter 8 was about economic change, starting with the market revolution and the specialization of each region, and then getting into the cotton complex. Then chapter 9 was more about political change and reform. We talked about Jacksonian democracy. We talked about universal white male suffrage. So that's all going to be in the elections, the important elections, 1824 and 1828. And then the second party system, the rise of the Whig Party and the new Democratic Party. Then chapter 10 goes back to 1800 and starts all over again in the same time period, but looking at social reform, changes within society, various movements that are going to grow that people become committed to, and they begin to join organizations to try to make moral and social changes within society at the same time. So let's go ahead and look at this particular chapter. All right. Okay, so here we go. Religion, reform, and culture. So again, look at the dates here. It fits within our time period. One of the early parts of this that kind of pervades throughout time period 4 is this idea of the Second Great Awakening. When we talked about the First Great Awakening, it was during the colonial period. And this was when people were beginning to somewhat resist the Church of England, and they began to branch off and have their own independent thoughts about religion. And so the Second Great Awakening is going to come largely in response to the big push and movement in the market revolution. Think about what people are doing. They're committed to making money. They're specializing. They're working all the time with manufacturing, growth of cotton in the South, growth of food in the Western states. And so the church is no longer the center of their lives or their community. So this Second Great Awakening is going to kind of revive this importance of religion and moral behavior within people's lives. You know, think about the idea of greed and money and how that detracts from what would be a religious moral approach to the way one person would live. So if we're looking at a comparison between the First and the Second Great Awakening, remember always when you're doing a comparison, you need to think about similarities, but you also need to think about differences. So these are some of the ways that the two religious movements are similar. All right, clearly it's going to be this foundation, this emphasis on religious teaching to be the center and the influence of people's lives. This is also going to be uniquely American. We're going to be seeing these traveling ministers that go throughout the United States, or during the colonial period, going throughout the colonies of what becomes the United States, spreading this idea of religious influence. And then you've got new denominations that are going to form. All of them are going to be Protestant in their affiliation, but they're going to be separate groups. So we call those sects, S-E-C-T-S, the Protestant sects, which would be different denominations that are going to be involved here. And then also you're going to see more involvement of women within these various religious groups that are going to form during both the First and the Second Great Awakening. But here's how they differ. Clearly, time period will be different. You've got different leaders within each of the Great Awakening movements. You'll remember that we read some of the works of Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield during the First Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards, he was the minister who really used that fire and brimstone with the sinners in the hands of an angry God. Then in the Second Great Awakening, we've got a new generation of ministers that will be very popular. And when they were traveling around, and if they were going to be in your region or in your community, people went from very, very wide distances to come and hear them speak. Charles Grandison Finney was probably the most popular, but then also Lyman Beecher. And he will be very, very prominent as well. So Charles Grandison Finney and Lyman Beecher are the main ministers of the Second Great Awakening that we would associate with that. The main message here that they try to get across, one is that God is giving salvation in the First Great Awakening, that you've got to make sure that God is on your side, that you've not done anything to displease God if you want to have this, eternal life. Then in the second Great Awakening, it's going to be more of, you can control that in some ways, that your own individual thought of what's right and what's wrong should be kind of directing this, that you've got salvation that you can acquire on your own. It's not really God granting it to you, it's you and your works here on earth. So this became kind of popular among this newly emerging middle class, people who were now able, with their own hard work, to be able to control their own economic status. Now with their own solid commitment to moral behavior, can also now control their salvation. So that was, again, it's this individualism, this idea of free will, that's going to be important and be the message that's passed on. Then the impact here, this is where we see a pretty clear distinction between the two. During the First Great Awakening, we're going to see a lot of diversity of religion in the colonies. We're going to see new churches that split apart from the old ones, and they're all kind of separate. But what we see in the Second Great Awakening is this cooperation among the various denominations, where you've got all the new denominations that had formed, but now they're going to kind of start to blend together in their message about individual opportunity for salvation. And then it's also going to spark a lot of reform movements. And that's what we're going to focus on next, where the outcome, if we're thinking about the causes and the effects of the First Great Awakening, the effects of that First Great Awakening would be this idea of republicanism, this idea of if you can choose your own form of worship, then you should be able to choose your own form of government. Well, here, the Second Great Awakening, where it's really emphasizing this idea of morality, about your own personal behavior determining your salvation, then that's also going to foster these reform movements, which will be organizations of people trying to expand that beyond their own lives into the lives of their people within their own communities. All right, so what that launches, all these reform movements, we can call the benevolent empire. Benevolent means like charity, and in these various movements that become reform efforts across the country. Some have more success than others, but look at all of the different areas of reform that will be sparked here. Temperance, which is talking about the abuse of alcohol and trying to kind of tamp that down a little bit. The asylum movement, this is going to be dealing with the mentally ill, and then the penal reform is going to be about prison reform. Abolitionism, with the slavery issue that becomes more prominent, women's rights, and then also education reform. So those are the ones that I want to speak to here for the next few minutes. Temperance reform is going to take a long time before we ever see prohibition of alcohol in the early 1900s. So keep that in mind, that we're first talking about temperance during the Second Great Awakening in the 1820s and 1830s is when that first begins. So it will take about 100 years before we actually see full-scale temperance reform at the national level. So what they're really focusing on here to start with is within local communities and within families. So look at this, this image, and this is one that is pretty popular from this early period of temperance reform. You want to look at the title, The Drunkard's Progress from the First Glass to the Grave, and then look what happens. Step number one, the guy fairly well dressed, got his nice top hat there. He's got his first glass there of alcohol, a glass with a friend, no harm, no big deal. Then he goes up a step, a glass to keep the cold out. So here he is, he's got a whole bottle there that he's drinking from. He's still pretty well dressed. But then look at this, a glass too much, drunk and riotous. And so here now he's causing trouble. And then step 5, the summit attained, jolly companions, a confirmed drunkard. So here he is out with the boys, drinking, smoking cigars. But then look who's left at home. There's his wife crying and her little child that's being abandoned. The house is burning up. You know, things are just, you know, going astray at home, but he's out with his friends. Then we're on this downhill slide. So where things are still fairly controlled here, look what happens when they reach the summit. Poverty and disease, he's fallen apart here. forsaken by his friends. Now he's all alone. Desperation and crime. So now he's resorted to, causing harm to the entire community. And then death. So this is the progress. So these people who were really prominent in temperance reform were trying to point out, if we're thinking about this cartoon as our sourcing elements, historical situation would definitely be the Second Great Awakening, this effort for reform, moral reform within the community to try to help solve some of the problems that were going on in the community. Temperance reform would be part of that. And then your point of view would be of someone who supports temperance reform, because their purpose here is to show how just, casual drinking can lead you down this path of destruction, is what they're trying to show. So that purpose and that point of view is all going to be tied together. All right, one area where we begin to see this play out in effect in the community is with laws at the local community level or at the state level in the case of the new state of Maine. So the Maine Laws, and I would emphasize this as an example of how temperance reform was actually carried out. The state of Maine, under the leadership of Neal Dow, he is an individual, a reformer from this early period of the 1800s. He is a temperance reformer who is committed to this cause. So you always want to associate Neal Dow with the Maine laws, which are going to ban alcohol in the state of Maine. So it becomes illegal in that particular state to buy or sell alcohol. And that's under the direction of Neal Dow. Now, later on, we're going to see in the early 1900s that becomes a national mandate under the prohibition of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. But for now, it's going to be a law within a state. So these temperance reformers, this is what they're working towards. Now, there's going to be another push for this type of reform as we go further into the 1800s. There's going to be temperance pledges that people are going to sign where you would promise not to drink alcohol, that you would abstain from that in your family. And it was all about trying to keep families together. Another area of reform is called Sabbatarian Reform. Sabbatarian comes from the word Sabbath. So this was an effort to try to restore Sunday as a time of worship, because think about what was going on again with this market revolution, this push for making money and profit and manufacturing as much as you possibly can and harvesting as much cotton as you possibly can, left very little time for families to be committed to going to church. So this idea of Sabbatarian reform meant that if you shut down business operation for everybody on Sundays, then nobody's getting behind by going to church, right? So if everybody shut down, then everyone has this equal opportunity to go to church, because if one person stays open, then they're going to be getting all of the business, right, in the market. So Sabbatarian reform was about protecting Sunday as a time to go to church. Now, we do still see remnants of Sabbatarian reform in society today. There's no mail delivery on Sunday. That was part of it. Alcohol sales on Sunday was part of Sabbatarian reform. Chick-fil-A is not open on Sunday. That's part of Sabbatarian reform as well. So the Christian Sabbath was preserved during this era of reform. So think again about what would have caused this. Well, you go back to the market revolution and the heavy emphasis on economy and profits and marketability. All right, so that makes that change. Then we're going to see another group that comes out of this moral second Great Awakening movement, and that's going to be the Transcendentalist. And they take it a step further, and they're going to say that becoming one with nature, understanding nature, becoming really committed to and recognizing how nature operates, that's going to get you one step closer to God. And it will be transcendentalist, or you would be transcending, right, your position here on earth to having this commitment to God. So again, it's an individual relationship with God, that the closer you become with nature, the closer you become with God. So look at this cartoon here where the guy's holding up his own end of the hammock, self-reliance. So this kind of moves away from that organized religion to one of an individual relationship with God. And some of the more famous transcendentalists are going to be here. We've got Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson is going to probably be the main one who we'll talk about here in just a second. And then some of his other followers who all come to Concord, Massachusetts, where he ends up living, would be Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, and Walt Whitman. They're going to be kind of the main literary promoters of the transcendentalist ideas. They're going to be very prolific writers. They're going to write a lot of essays and a lot of books and pamphlets and things that become quite popular. There's also going to be a lot of art that comes out of this same period that's just very nature oriented, these pastoral scenes. This becomes known as the Hudson River School. School not like a building that you go and attend, but like a school of thought or an approach to art is called the Hudson River School. And notice how this is all just very peaceful, very tranquil, very idealistic in terms of nature. And so this is the American Renaissance, the Hudson River School, where it's talking about all of this wide open nature. And so if you become one with that nature, then you're also becoming closer to God. All right, so here's kind of the source of this transcendentalist movement, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he goes to Concord, Massachusetts, and he starts writing. And he's talking about that nature is part of God. So if you get a better understanding of nature, then you get a better understanding of God. And more and more people begin to follow along in what he has to say. Henry David Thoreau is probably one of his greatest proteges, one of his students who really follows what Emerson has to say. And Thoreau, he's going to actually kind of retreat from society. He's going to build a cabin on Walden Pond, and he's going to live there for a couple of years. And he keeps kind of like this journal of all of these thoughts that he has, and it becomes known as Walden. And it's a very popular publication of this transcendentalist approach. And one of the other important pieces that he writes is Civil Disobedience. And I would really emphasize this in your notes. Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau becomes the foundation for many, many, many modern protests that we will see. Civil rights movement of the 1960s. You're going to see the ideas of Gandhi will be based on Thoreau's work with civil disobedience. And all of this comes down to he disagrees with the moral approach to the war with Mexico. We're going to see here in our next unit that the United States goes to war with Mexico in the 1840s. And he disagrees with the origin of that war. And you'll see why it's controversial here in a week or two. But when he disagrees with the moral start to the war, he refuses to pay his taxes because that tax money is going to build an army to fight in a war that he believes is an unjust and unfair war. So he's willing to go to jail for that. Civil meaning civic, right? His civic responsibility, and disobedience. He's not going to go and destroy and tear things up. He's just going to non-violently protest against something that he believes is inappropriate by his government. So civil disobedience, his writing about this is the foundation that Gandhi will use and that Martin Luther King will use, the SCLC and some of the other civil rights organizations will use in the 1960s. So that's a very important piece that comes out of this transcendentalist movement, again, grounded in the idea of morality from the Second Great Awakening. Okay, there were women transcendentalists. One in particular, Margaret Fuller, was a very, very strong writer. She also lived in and around Boston, near where Emerson was, in Concord. And she was the editor of the transcendentalist publication called The Dial. So The Dial was like the magazine where all of the transcendentalists would write articles and features and things that would be distributed pretty widely across New England. So Margaret Fuller was very much a part of that. And she was really working towards greater education for women. So she's kind of on this fringe here with the transcendentalists, but she's also tied in with the women's rights movement at the same time. Walt Whitman, he comes along as well with the Transcendentalist, and one of his more famous works is called Leaves of Grass. And again, you can see a lot of very vivid imagery, nature worked in here with his work in his publications with the Transcendentalist movement. Now, not everybody thought that this was a great idea, because some people thought these folks are just so self-absorbed that they are losing sight of what's good for all of society because they're only looking out for themselves. And so those who would disagree often wrote works that would warn people against an individualist approach, which was what the Transcendentalists were talking about, right? That you yourself become one with nature. So these are two works, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. I think you may have read this either this year or last year in Lang. And this is talking about these two people in this community who end up having an adulterous affair, and a child is born out of it because that was something that they wanted as individuals. But then it talks about the harm that comes to the entire community as a result. And then the same thing in Herman Melville's book, Moby Dick, and how this whole ship of people are lost at sea as they're looking for fulfilling their own dream of capturing this whale and all of that. So that not everybody agrees with what the Transcendentalists were doing. Others are going to take the work of the Transcendentalists and take it even more to the extreme. And that would be the utopian societies that will form. Brook Farm is one of those, not too far outside of Boston as well. So here's Concord, where Emerson and Thoreau and all of the others lived here that were part of this Transcendentalist movement. And then Brook Farm is going to be over here. And by utopian societies, we're talking about self-sustaining societies where they've got shared ownership of property, shared responsibility for that property, and it is completely self-sufficient. Everybody is responsible for everybody else in that community. So it's supposed to be this ideal situation where you don't have anyone who is ultra wealthy and in charge of everybody else, and nobody is kind of left behind and in some sort of a lesser role. Everyone would have been equal in the Brook Farm in these utopian societies. Some of the others are going to be based more on this idea of devout morality and not being distracted from your worship of God. The Shakers would come to mind with that particular approach. The Shakers did not believe in marriage. They didn't believe with relationships between men and women because that distracts from your commitment to God. Now, obviously, if they don't believe in marriage or relationships between men and women, then there's not going to be a new generation of Shaker children being brought into the community if they're not procreating and reproducing on their own. They relied on people choosing this form of life to come into the community and sustain it. So it doesn't last very long. Now notice these chairs here up on the wall. One thing that the Shakers were definitely known for was their furniture. They were great craftsmen and made beautiful furniture. The Shaker style furniture, which is very simplistic, and it's pretty distinctive, the style of furniture that they constructed. And you still have Shaker style furniture today, even though the Shaker community doesn't really exist anymore. So these utopian societies, supposedly these ideal societies, they really don't end up lasting very long, because sooner or later, people in the group are going to get frustrated, thinking that someone is not pulling their weight in the community and that others are taking advantage of other people. And so eventually the communities did indeed fall apart. All right, another religious group that forms during this time period between 1800 and 1848 would be the Mormon Church, or the formal name for the Mormons would be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And where this began was in New York with Joseph Smith, who had visions that an angel had come and brought him information and this approach that he was believed to be provided with directions from God to move these people and to lead people in society. Well, as they are being harassed in New York, they begin to move farther and farther west. They end up in Illinois, in one of the communities in New York. And again, what they're doing, they've got shared ownership of property. They begin to vote as a block. And this was threatening to many people, that he was viewing himself and believed that he had these messages directly from God, that he had been provided with this prophecy. And many people began to condemn them. And he and his brother were actually arrested while they were in Nauvoo, Illinois. And while they were in jail, this mob shows up and they break in and they assassinate and kill Joseph Smith and his brother. So again, you've got this group of Mormons, the followers of Joseph Smith, that are being attacked, and they're not being allowed to worship as they want. So after Joseph Smith has been murdered, then Brigham Young, who was one of the Mormon followers, will take on the new leadership role, and he's going to lead the people further to the west out to Utah. Now, you need to think about where Utah would be located at this time. This is farther west than the boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. So that would mean that this would be outside of the United States. And so the idea was they could move out to Utah, they could set up their community there and live and worship as they pleased. So that was where they were headed, where they were setting up the region there, New Zion, as it was called, and in and around what becomes Salt Lake City. So this area of Mormon membership and population, once that's all acquired by the United States after the war with Mexico, then they're right back in the same situation about where their ability to worship the way that they want to would be implemented here. So look at this map of where they are traveling from. So sometimes we see this referred to as the Mormon Trail, this movement of Brigham Young. So they're moving out from Illinois out to this territory that at the time was not part of the United States. Now later on, very soon afterwards, it will become part of the United States. So that's the movement of the Mormon followers at that time. Today, there are Mormons all across the United States and across the world. All right, education reform. The key leader that you need to associate here is Horace Mann. So we talked about Neil Dow to associate with temperance reform. Horace Mann is going to be the education reformer, and he believed that it is absolutely essential for all American children to be educated in free public schools, that it should not only be something that the wealthy have access to, everyone should have access to education, because he believes that this is the great opportunity for success in the United States. So he's from Massachusetts, and he is in the Massachusetts state legislature as a senator. And he is going to get laws passed within that state that require free public school for all children, and it's paid for by taxpayer money. The state would oversee all of the schools, make sure that the curriculum is the same for all of the students who are going to school there. He wants teachers who actually know a little bit of something about what they're teaching, and to really improve the status of education. And Horace Mann does a great job with that within his state of Massachusetts, and then it expands, first in New England, then into other states. Now, the South is going to lag behind in that, because again, if children are in school, then they're not at home helping out on the farms. And so that's going to be a problem as we see moving forward. And then also this idea of compulsory attendance, requirement of children attending school, that's also going to become problematic sometimes when we get child labor in the more industrial centers of the United States. But for this early period, Horace Mann has great success in his home state of Massachusetts getting education reform. All right. Then Dorthea Dix, I would also know about her. She is a reformer during this same time period who's going to take on two different issues. One is mental illness and one is prison reform. And the two kind of overlap, because what she was finding was that the mentally ill patients were being thrown into prison with criminals. And so she's saying they've not committed a crime, they have mental illness, and they're not being provided any sort of treatment or help to get better. And she's saying the two have got to be separated. So she really promoted the idea of creating asylums for the mentally ill to gain treatment and help. But then she also began to look at prisons. And she began to see that if you put a person in prison for a crime that they have committed, excuse me, that when they've served their time and they get out, what's going to stop them from committing crimes again? There's been no rehabilitation. There's been no reform of what went wrong to start with that led this person down the path to commit a crime. If anything, they're farther behind than they were before because they haven't been working. They're probably more desperate. They don't have any money. They don't have any job. So it's probably going to be even more difficult for them to make their way in society in a way that's going to conform with the laws and social norms. So she is, in the one sense, promoting the creation of asylums for the mentally ill, but also to change the approach of prisons. And what we end up is the penitentiary system. So the penitentiary reform, prisons become penitentiaries. Now look at the word penitentiary. If you look at the root of that word, it comes from penitence. And if you repent of something, it means you're asking for forgiveness. So this idea of a penitentiary is reform of people who have committed a crime. The first of these big penitentiaries that comes out of the work of Dorthea Dix is the Eastern State Penitentiary, which is in Philadelphia. And this is a sketch of what Eastern State looked like. I'm going to show you some actual pictures of it because I went there a couple of years ago and it was fascinating. But you go in and it's got these huge stone walls around the entire complex. And then the center of the penitentiary is right here. So this would be where like the guards would be located. And then each one of these hallways that moves off of that center part like a spoke would be the cells that the prisoners would be housed in. Does this structure remind you of anything, the layout of this? Look at it closely, where you've got this central area and then you've got hallways that branch off. Doesn't it sort of look like your middle school design, where you've got the 8th grade and then you've got pod A, B, C, and D, and you've got the 7th grade and pod A, B, C, and D. Doesn't it kind of look that way? Well, here's why it was set up in this structure. They didn't have closed circuit TV. They didn't have any sort of electronic surveillance system. But a guard could stand right here in this central area and monitor every one of these hallways of prison cells at one time. So why might they have set up a middle school this way? I don't know. But anyway, here is Eastern State today. And you can go and tour it. And it's kind of an interesting tour. But what I think would be really fun, they open this up and they have at Halloween, where you spend the night at Eastern State. And it's like this overnight haunted house. And I just can't even imagine how scary that would be. But anyway, you go in these big stone entrance ways and you come in, and then they talk about prison reform and Dorthea Dix. And then you've got the layout here. And then this is around the edge of the prison. Here's the hallways that I'm talking about. So I'm standing in the center and you can see all the way down the hallway. This is what a cell would look like. So you've got a little bit of light here in the top, and then you've got a bed and you've got a desk. And then the only thing that they would put in the cell with these prisoners was a Bible, because the idea was with penitentiary reform, if the only thing that's in that room with you is a Bible, at some point you might pick it up and read it. And at some point you might figure out the error of your ways. And then it's all again tied into that second great awakening, this idea of an individual relationship with God. And then that's going to help you to reform. They've also got off of each prison, it is a separate outdoor area, and they would go outside, get a little bit of air, and then go right back in. So they didn't ever really interact with anybody else, and the cells were staggered. So if I'm facing out of my cell through a little window in the door, then the cell across from me wouldn't be directly across, it would be staggered. So it was like every other one. So you really couldn't see the other people. All right, so that was our tour guide, and he was fabulous. Al Capone actually spent some time at Eastern State. And so here is his prison record from the time that he was at Eastern State. But you'll remember that Al Capone was a gangster. And when he got to when he got to Eastern State, he bribed the prison guards, and look what his cell looked like. There's his cell. So he had quite a different setup than everybody else at Eastern State. But that was just kind of part of what Al Capone was, right? He was a gangster, and so he bribed his way into having a little bit better situation, actually a lot better situation than the other prisoners. All right, so as I said, section 2, don't worry about section 2. So sections 3 and 4, we're putting together with the reforms, abolition reform, and then women's rights reform. So this is just more of the reform movements, but these just take hold on a little bit more wider scale. African Americans are not totally on board with the American Colonization Society that we talked about in chapter 9. And the free Black community begins to organize a little bit more tightly. And they're going to be under the leadership here of Richard Allen. So here he is, he's from Philadelphia, and he starts the first AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is a branch of, it started as he broke off from the Methodist Church, and he got permission to start his own church, and it's going to be called Mother Bethel AME Church. It's the oldest of the AME churches, and it still functions today. It is gorgeous. I'm going to show you a picture of it here in just a second. But Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, this was a church for African Americans, led by African Americans. Richard Allen was a free Black living in the area, and it is going to become quite popular. The AME churches expand. There are still AME churches today. There's a large AME church in Marietta, Turner Chapel AME Church, very, very large church. And this was, when we get to the 1960s, the Black churches are going to be really the center for planning a lot of the nonviolent protests. But here's where it begins, is with Richard Allen. Another very prominent African-American who contributed to this early period of the New Republic is Benjamin Banneker. And he is very, very brilliant in his surveying and his city planning. And he's going to be a contributor to laying out the plan for Washington, D.C. and planning all of that out. All right, so David Walker is going to be a little bit more radical in his approach, where Richard Allen is going to be approaching this through a community of churches, the AME Church. David Walker is going to set out this, what he calls the appeal to the colored citizens of the world. And he's really saying, he's calling on African Americans to come together and revolt. And so he's warning whites that if they don't provide freedom and end slavery, that they're going to end up paying a price in the afterlife, that God is going to punish them later on for holding people as slaves. So he, in his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, I would emphasize this, that this is a publication in the Black community that is sending a warning to the white population to end slavery, or they're going to face some sort of problem with a revolt on earth, and then also among slaves, that slaves are going to rise up in revolt. They're not going to stand for this any longer. And then also in the afterlife, God would punish them. So he never actually plots and plans and carries out a revolt or a rebellion, but he puts this out there, this publication, as a warning. Well, this sent up all kinds of alarms in Southern communities. They banned David Walker's publications from coming in the mail. And the Southern states actually kind of clamped down on their slaves and the laws within their states that are limiting the actions of enslaved people within their communities. One individual who does carry out a slave rebellion in the 1830s is Nat Turner, and he is in Virginia. He's going to rise up in rebellion, and there's going to be about 50 or so whites who are killed in the process of his rebellion. He believed that God called on him to lead his people to freedom and lead them in this revolt. And when that happened, the white community gets together, they track them, the people down who were rebelling, they hang Nat Turner for his role, and they send a very stark message in the brutality that they inflict on the people who were revolting, to send a message not to plot or plan any sort of rebellion in the future. So Nat Turner's rebellion, you want to think about that this was an actual rebellion that occurred where David Walker was predicting that there would be a rebellion and warning the white population. So there's a lot of fear here. Now, keep in mind that this is in Virginia in the upper South. Not a lot of cotton is being grown there. The reaction that people in Virginia may have is going to be a little different from what the reaction to people in South Carolina and Georgia would have to this similar type of revolt. In Virginia, sometimes you would see gradual emancipation where slave owners would eventually free their slaves. But Nat Turner's revolt really does turn the white population to become more paranoid of what's happening here. In South Carolina, I don't believe your book talks about this particular slave revolt, but you need to add it because it actually happened before Nat Turner. This was in the 1820s, but Denmark Vesey was a free Black living in Charleston, which is kind of unusual because you think about the deeply entrenched enslavement of people in South Carolina. We know that the population of South Carolina has more enslaved persons than it is the white population. But Denmark Vesey was a free Black. And the way he earned his freedom was kind of interesting. He actually won it in a lottery. So think about the Georgia lottery where you go and you pay $1 and you get your numbers, and then they draw those numbers and then you might win millions of dollars. Well, Denmark Vesey entered this lottery in Charleston, and his number, he had the winning ticket, and he won his prize here, this money, right? The East Bay Street lottery. He won this money, prize money, and bought his freedom. So he was a free man living in Charleston. This is his house where Denmark Vesey lived once he was a free man. And today it is right smack in the middle of the College of Charleston campus. And I believe students live there. They were a little unnerved when I'm walking around. I found Denmark Vesey's house, and, they've got their bicycles and they have their hammocks and all this stuff hanging up in the yard, but it's right in the middle of College Charleston campus. So this was the house where Denmark Vesey lived. Well, he was plotting a rebellion, or supposedly he was, within his church. And you may remember a few years ago in Charleston, there was this, the AME church in Charleston, downtown Charleston, where a white supremacist went in to the church on an evening where they were having a Bible study, and he killed all of these church members. That was the same church that Denmark Vesey was a member of way back in the 1820s. So Denmark Vesey was supposedly plotting this rebellion, and the white community members caught wind of what he was planning. And so they arrest him and execute him, again, to send a message not to plot a rebellion in their society and in their community. So the Denmark Vesey revolt that was planned but not yet carried out, the Nat Turner rebellion that happens less than 10 years later in Virginia, all of this really causes the white population to double down on their efforts to really control slavery and their enslaved persons within their states. All right, in the North, the opposition to this becomes more organized. Now, we mentioned in chapter 9 that there was an abolitionist organization called the American Colonization Society that forms the area in Africa, Liberia, that would return in former slaves back to Africa. William Lloyd Garrison says this is not working. So he and some of his other prominent leaders in New England he's from Boston as well, are going to form a new society, a new organization called the American Anti-Slavery Society. So let me say that again. The first organization was the American Colonization Society, not as successful. The American Anti-Slavery Society is led by this man, William Lloyd Garrison, and they're going to approach things three ways to try to end slavery. One is through just mass publication of essays and speeches and pamphlets and all of that. So his newspaper is called The Liberator. So the Liberator newspaper is published by William Lloyd Garrison. I would highly, highly, highly emphasize William Lloyd Garrison, the Liberator newspaper, and the American Anti-Slavery Society all together. All right, so he is saying that this is bad for society all the way around, that slavery has got to come to an end. So the publications of the newspaper, the Liberator, and then the pamphlets and the speeches will be his first part, right? So here's the American Anti-Slavery Society. He's also going to have a speaking tour using the Lyceum. The Lyceum movement was like public speaking. People would go and for entertainment would go and listen to speeches. And the American Anti-Slavery Society was very, very prominent in the speaking tours. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who had snuck out and run away from slavery, becomes one of his most prominent figures in the American Anti-Slavery Society. It is one thing for William Lloyd Garrison to be speaking out against slavery. It is a totally other dynamic to have a former slave himself tell his story, to draw people in to be committed to the cause. And Frederick Douglass was incredibly effective in doing this. And so this is Frederick Douglass later in life, becomes probably the face of the Anti-Slavery Society with William Lloyd Garrison. The Grimke sisters, here they are, Sarah and Angelina. They are also going to be important in the American Anti-Slavery Society. They were from South Carolina. Their father was a prominent slave owner. They were morally opposed to what they were witnessing on their father's farm and plantation, and they left and they went north, became Quakers, who are pacifists, as you know, didn't agree with slavery, and they go on tour and begin to talk about their firsthand perspective from the slave owners' side of what they were seeing, because many of these people in the North, they'd never seen what life was like in the South. They had never witnessed slavery firsthand. And so they're bringing this to the American Anti-Slavery Society, is bringing these accounts to people in the North to draw more support. All right, so you've got the publications, you've got the speeches, and then the other part of the American Anti-Slavery Society was going to be trying to help runaways, and that was through the Underground Railroad. So they start to organize a way to get people out of slavery. So the Underground Railroad, we don't know for sure all of the places that were involved in the Underground Railroad, because again, it was all secret. But we can see that these were primarily the paths that were taken following the Mississippi River. We know that there was a heavy concentration of enslaved population here in and around the Mississippi River. So this was one route out to get to these states that were free states. We know following the ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, that was another route. Notice the ships here. There were a number of people who would try to sneak on board ships to get themselves to another port. So the Underground Railroad, again, the network was very, very sophisticated in how they would plan people who were supportive of the cause and would allow runaways to hide out there, and there were secret codes. There's also been a lot of work done where patterns on quilts would also indicate directions and movements, where people would, wash quilts and hang them out to dry, and it would actually be coded messages, the patterns that were stitched in the quilts, like what is a safe house, what direction do you need to go next, that kind of thing. Harriet Tubman, her nickname was Black Moses because she went back and forth. And once she ran away and got her own freedom, she went back multiple times into the Deep South to get her family members and other people to freedom. And so she brought hundreds of people out of slavery herself. And she was very, very prominent. Again, she was an important part of Garrison's anti-slavery society. There was actually a bounty out for Harriet Tubman, and she was never caught. So she's a fantastic story. There was a great movie that came out either last year or the year before called Harriet, and it does tell her story. And it's a great, great movie if you get the opportunity to see that. This is a church in Savannah, the First African Baptist Church, right in the middle of Savannah. It's right off of the River Street, but it's kind of across from the open air market in Savannah. And the story that they tell here is that they were a stop on the Underground Railroad, that slaves who were running away, that this was a safe house. And they will tell you that under the floors here in the main sanctuary, that there were passages where slaves could hide out and be protected. Now, did they have any proof that this was true? No. But do we have any proof that it was not true? No. But here's the outside of the church. If you just go there, knock on the door, they will be glad to show you around and tell you their story. This is a picture that I took of the floor where they pulled the rug back for me to see these holes that are in patterns, and it's all the way along the floors. Supposedly this was the air holes that would allow slaves to gain air as they were hiding under the floorboard of this church. Again, it may be true. We're not sure, but again, that's just one example here in Georgia of a place that is claiming to be one of the stops in the Underground Railroad. All right, so then the third area, so if we've got the American Anti-Slavery Society that is publishing and speaking about ending slavery, they are working to free slaves through, the Underground Railroad and other efforts to get slaves to freedom. Then the third part of the American Anti-Slavery Society is to really press to get legislative action to end slavery. So they send petition after petition after petition to the Congress to end slavery. And in 1836, look what happens. The House of Representatives passes what's called the gag rule. The gag rule means that you can't speak about something. So look what they say here. The North is some of the people in the North that are relying very heavily on the South for cotton to drive their manufacturing are not really on board with disrupting all of this. So they're not vocally supporting the abolitionist cause, because you have to remember, even though the abolitionists are getting a lot of attention, it's a small percentage of the population, but they have wide media presence. So it's like this small group that's getting a ton of attention, where a large portion of the Northern population at this time in the 1830s were not committed to ending slavery. And so they agree, the Northern and the Southern members of the House of Representatives agree to what's called the gag rule. They are not going to discuss slavery in the Congress. So anytime a bill is proposed, they just don't even discuss it or debate it or vote on it. They don't pay attention to these petitions that are coming in from the American Anti-Slavery Society. John Quincy Adams, after he's president, he actually goes back into the legislature for Massachusetts, and he's in the House of Representatives at this point. Look what he has to say about the gag rule. And there he is. He's the first president to actually have his photograph taken, his real photograph. I hold the resolution to be a direct violation, talking about the gag rule, violation of the Constitution of the United States, the rules of this House of Representatives, and the rights of my constituents. That if he proposes a law or if a petition is brought forward, he believes that the rules require that it be listened to or debated or voted on. And so he's saying that this gag rule is saying that the legislative body is only going to agree to listen to certain things, and he disagrees that that's appropriate. All right, so the last thing that we want to mention is the women's rights movement. And this in many ways overlaps with the abolition movement, because many, many women are part of the abolition movement. Women are greatly involved in the Second Great Awakening. They're heavily involved in the abolition movement, and they are also going to be very much involved, obviously, in gaining themselves more rights. And this is a departure from this idea of the separate spheres, where we've seen that women have one role in the home, and then the men's role is outside of the home working and all of that. And then the whole idea of Republican motherhood. So this cult of domesticity, right? Domestic meaning within the home. The cult of domesticity is that the women are responsible for maintaining the home and raising the children and not being outside the home. That's all going to be challenged here by this growing women's movement. And part of that has to do with the growing middle class. So now work with me here. If you've got more money available because you have more people in the middle class, right? That's going to be that group in the manufacturing in the North that are not necessarily the factory owners, but they're not the factory workers. They're the managers. They're in between. So these are people who have a decent income. They are comfortable, not rich, but they're comfortable. The women can actually hire domestic workers to do the cooking and the cleaning for them. So they've got a little bit of free time. And with this free time, they begin to have their own ideas of independence and opinions about politics and everything else. So these women are going to begin to challenge the cult of domesticity, meaning the priority of women in the household. This Goodies Ladies book, this was a magazine of the time that had fashions and articles that might be of interest of a lady of leisure, a woman from this middle class, this new middle class woman who has free time. She might subscribe to the Goodies Ladies book and talk about, oh, I would like to buy this dress, this finished made dress or something like that, or begin to read articles about politics. So these women become part of the moral causes, the temperance movement. There were a lot of women involved in temperance, like we saw Dorthea Dix with the prison reform and mental health reform. All of these women who end up becoming critical in the women's rights movement also were part of the abolitionist movement. Look at some of these names. I know last year in world history, you talked about Mary Wollstonecraft. You've got Susan B. Anthony. You've heard of her. We've already talked about Harriet Tubman. Sojourner Truth. She is another really, really important abolitionist woman. She's a speaker, great speaker. She and Frederick Douglass travel around with William Lloyd Garrison and speak. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, heavily involved in the women's movement, and they started in the abolitionist movement. But where they get outraged is they go to this international abolitionist conference, and they're not allowed to speak because they're women. And they're like, what? Wait a minute. Why are we not? We're trying to fight for equality, but yet you're telling me I can't speak on this issue because I'm a woman. That's not equality. So they kind of branch off and begin to focus on women's rights. Some states are going to end up passing what are called married women's property laws. So again, these are state level laws that begin to change the rights of women. It's nothing coming from the federal government. That doesn't happen until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. But here we begin to see in the mid 1800s that some states, here this example is from New York, look what they've done. An act was passed by the legislature in New York for the protection of the property of married women, that if you inherit land, if you have property and you get married, it's your land still, it is your property still, it is your money still. It doesn't automatically become the property of your husband. So that is protecting the property of those women. So again, you're going to see that at the state level in some states, not all, but in some. New York was one of those early adopters. These two women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, are the ones who really start this foundation for an organized effort to demand women's rights, where the American Anti-Slavery Society becomes very organized to try to challenge slavery in America. These two women become more organized to challenge the rights of women in America. And they hold a meeting in their home community of Seneca Falls, New York, and they're going to have a convention, and it's fairly well attended. Notice that it's here in July of 1848, and they've listed all of the people who have come to listen to the speakers. So you've got Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Cady Easton, and so we've got all these women, And then we also have a number of men who will attend. And that's also going to be important. Look at one individual's name who's listed here. Look who I've found. Frederick Douglass actually came to support Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. So again, we see this crossover between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. What you need to remember about the Seneca Falls Convention. All right, so we've got Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Seneca Falls Convention. They have all these speeches for, a couple of days about the importance of women's rights. But the outcome of this meeting was a document that they produced called the Declaration of Sentiments. And I would also emphasize this in your notes, the Declaration of Sentiments. A sentiment is an idea or a thought or an emotion. So they're declaring their thoughts from the Seneca Falls Convention. All right, now we're going to make a comparison between their publication and the Declaration of Independence. So let me remind you what is in the Declaration of Independence. We had an introduction. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. They're talking about the colonies from England, right? And they're talking about natural rights, laws of nature that God entitles them. And when it's not being respected, mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. All right, then the second part, it talks about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they have natural rights. And then they go into this big whole thing. If you'll remember, this is all about the social contract, that they have a right to throw this off, okay, from the King of Great Britain. This is a history of repeated injuries by the king, let facts be submitted to the candid world. And then they list all of the grievances that they have against the king, right? He has done all of this to us. And we looked at that and how those were all examples of unfair practices against each of the colonies. All right. So then at the very end, they finally say we break away and we declare independence. All right. Now look at what Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments does. Look what they've done. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. This is exactly the same introduction, but they've woven it around to talk about women, right? One portion of the family. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. I would emphasize that in my notes, that this is the highlight of the Declaration of Independence or Declaration of Sentiments. We hold these truths to be self-evident. It is obvious that all men and women are created equal. Okay. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having a direct object, the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has never permitted her to exercise her rights in the elective franchise, meaning voting. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice. Women can't elect representatives. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded of men, both natives and foreigners. Having deprived her the first rights of a citizen of the elective franchise, leaving her without representation in the halls of legislature, he has oppressed her on all sides. And it goes on and on and on, all of the lack of rights that women have. And so then in the very end, it talks about that they demand that they be provided, that they have immediate admission to all of the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. If they're being counted in the population, right, for representation, then they should be having rights as well. So why would they have structured this document this way? How popular was the Declaration of Independence at this time? Incredibly popular. So if they had just had an article in the newspaper about this group of women and men who got together at Seneca Falls and they were demanding equal rights for women, it's not going to gain nearly the attention as structuring it on the heels of the Declaration of Independence. So they use this for literary effect, right? So they've got this idea of hearkening back to something that is valued and that they're committed to. And so they're demanding, they're trying to prove a point, right? It is it is very obvious that women are not being treated equally to men. All right, so here they are, the leaders at Seneca Falls: Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony ends up joining in their efforts as well. So these three women become the main leaders of this early women's movement. All right, so there you have it. There's chapter 10. That's the end of unit 4. Remember, chapter 8 is about economic change with the market revolution. Chapter 9 is about political change with the second party system and the rise of Andrew Jackson and the Whigs and the Democrats. And then chapter 10 is all about social reform, as we've just looked at. So until next time, keep reading and go make history.